I've worked the night shift at Harold's Bar for 2 years now. It's a hole-in-the-wall dive, the kind of place where the smell of stale beer seeps into your clothes, and the regulars have names, but no stories. It wasn't a dream job. Hell, it wasn't even a job I liked. But when you're stuck in a small town with no prospects, you take what you can get. Bartending for drunks and cleaning up the endless mess of spilled drinks was better than nothing, or so I told myself. The truth was, I hated it. The dim lights, the same tired songs on the jukebox, the endless drone of slurred voices. It all wore me down night after night. I had been a nobody in high school, a nobody now, and Harold's felt like a tomb where the nobodies went to die. I was just there, a warm body behind the counter, waiting for the clock to strike closing time. Most nights were the same. The regulars would shuffle in, tell their bad jokes, and I'd pretend to laugh. Wednesdays were especially dead. By 1 a.m., the place was usually empty, and I'd find myself wiping down the bar over and over, just for something to do. That's how it was that night. Quiet, like the whole town had been swallowed by sleep, leaving me alone in that dingy room. It was almost 2 a.m. when I heard the door creak open. I looked up, expecting one of the regulars to stumble in for a last call, but it wasn't anyone I knew. A man I'd never seen before stepped in, tall and gaunt, with long, stringy hair hanging in greasy clumps around his face. His skin was pale, sickly almost, and his clothes were worn, like he'd been traveling for days without changing. I'm not one to judge, especially at Harold's. You get all kinds of people passing through. But there was something about this guy, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't say a word, just slid into a booth at the far corner of the bar, his back to me. I gave him a few minutes, expecting him to come up and order, but he stayed there, staring at the wall like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. I wasn't about to let some stranger creep me out in my own place, so I grabbed a menu and walked over. "Hey, can I get you something to drink?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. No response. He didn't even look at me. His eyes stayed locked on the peeling wallpaper, and his face looked empty, blank, like he wasn't even in his own body. I shrugged it off and went back behind the bar. Maybe he was just tired or lost in thought, but something didn't sit right with me. The way he sat so still, the way he seemed to blend into the shadows. I kept glancing over at him, trying to focus on my work, but he never moved. Then, just as I was about to start cleaning up, the door opened again. 2 more men walked in. They were dressed almost the same as the first guy. Old, tattered clothes, faces pale and drawn. They didn't say a word, just walked straight to the booth and sat down across from the first man. And just like him, they didn't speak. They didn't even look at each other. They just sat. By now, my stomach was in knots. There was something wrong with this. The air in the bar felt thick, heavy, like I was suddenly breathing underwater. I glanced at the clock. 2:10 a.m. Time to call it a night. I grabbed my coat, ready to lock up and leave. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it. A soft whisper, like air escaping a cracked pipe. "Stay." I froze, my hand still on the coat rack. The word hung in the air, barely audible, but clear enough to make my skin crawl. I turned around slowly, and the 3 men were standing now. Their heads were tilted slightly. Their eyes, those empty, dead eyes, locked on me. "Stay," they said again, in unison, their voices a wet, rasping sound that didn't belong in this world. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. I fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, or jammed, or something. Panic rose in my throat as I yanked at it again, harder, but it was like the door had sealed itself shut. "Stay," the voices whispered again, louder this time, filling the room. The lights began to flicker, casting long, warped shadows across the walls. And then I saw them. More figures standing in the dark corners of the bar, where the light barely reached. Dozens of them, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes wide and fixed on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I felt their cold presence creeping closer, felt the icy weight of their stares pressing down on me. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the bar into darkness. I heard their footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming toward me. I pressed myself against the door, my heart racing, my mind screaming for me to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear. Then, just as quickly as it began, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The men were gone. The figures in the shadows, gone. Everything was exactly as it had been, except for one thing. On the bar, where the first man had been sitting, there was a small, crumpled note. I walked over, my legs shaking, and picked it up. The paper was old, yellowed, like it had been sitting there for years. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 2 words: "Don't follow." I didn't. I left that bar and never went back. Harold's shut down a few months later. No one said why, but the rumors spread. People said it was haunted, cursed. They said strange things happened there after dark. All I know is that whatever those men were, they weren't alive. And that night, I think I saw something I was never supposed to see. People always ask what it's like working the night shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I usually shrug and say it's quiet, lonely sometimes, but manageable. Truth is, I needed the job. I'd been laid off from the factory a few months back, bills piling up, and the graveyard shift at the gas station seemed like the only option until something better came along. It wasn't glamorous. The station was at mile marker 17, a stretch of highway that seemed to lead to nothing but darkness on either side. No nearby towns, just miles of barren road. Truckers would pull in sometimes, get their coffee, and be on their way. A few locals, the rare lost tourist. Most nights, it was just me and the flicker of fluorescent lights, the hum of the cooler, and my thoughts. That night, like so many others, I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine, waiting for the hours to pass. It was just after midnight when the headlights appeared, cutting through the blackness outside. An old sedan rolled in, clunking like it was on its last legs. I didn't think much of it. Another customer looking for a late-night fill-up. But then, the car stopped by pump 3, and no one got out. I waited, watching the car, expecting to see someone step out or roll down the window, but nothing happened. The engine was still running, the exhaust puffing out in the cold night air, but the car was eerily still. I gave it a minute before stepping outside to see what was going on. The air was cold, biting through my thin jacket. I walked up to the car and peered inside. The windows were fogged, making it impossible to see the driver. I knocked on the glass lightly, half expecting someone to wave me off or ask for a minute. No response. I knocked again, harder this time, and that's when the window rolled down just a crack. A smell hit me, sharp, metallic, like old blood mixed with something sour. It made my stomach turn, and for a moment, I hesitated. "Hey, you okay in there?" I called out, but the silence hung heavy in the air. Finally, the car door creaked open, and a man stepped out, or rather, stumbled out. His clothes were filthy. Dust, grime, and dark stains covered his jacket and pants. He looked disoriented, like he'd been walking for days, though he'd clearly driven there. He didn't even glance in my direction, just started shuffling toward the entrance of the gas station, dragging one foot behind him like it was injured. "Sir, you all right?" I called after him, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He didn't even slow down, just kept limping toward the station doors. Instinct told me something was wrong. Maybe it was the way he moved, or maybe it was the way my skin crawled when I got close to him. But I wasn't about to let some stranger with blood on his clothes wander around the store without knowing what was going on. I followed him inside, my pulse quickening. He was by the back fridges now, standing still, staring blankly at the rows of bottled drinks. I could see him more clearly under the fluorescent lights. His face was gaunt, skin tight and pale, and his eyes. There was something off about them, like they weren't really seeing anything. His hands twitched at his sides, dirty fingernails scraping lightly against his pants. I cleared my throat, hoping to break the strange tension. "Sir, you need some help." He didn't respond. His head tilted slightly, and for a split second, I thought he was going to look at me, but then his eyes stayed fixed on the glass in front of him. It was like he was frozen in place. I took a step back, uneasy. I glanced toward the phone behind the counter, thinking I might need to call for help. That's when he moved, his body jerking suddenly, like he'd been shocked awake. He staggered toward the counter, his foot still dragging, and I noticed something I hadn't before, a large dark stain spreading across the front of his jacket. My throat went dry. "You're hurt. You need a hospital," I said, trying to keep calm. His head jerked up, eyes locking on mine for the first time. There was something wild in them, something that made my heart race. He opened his mouth like he was going to speak, but no words came out, just a low, guttural rasp. Panic started to creep in. This wasn't normal. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. That's when he lunged. I barely had time to react. His body slammed into the counter, knocking over displays as I stumbled back, hitting the shelves behind me. He was on me in an instant, his filthy hands grabbing at my jacket, his breath hot and foul on my face. He wasn't trying to hurt me, I realized. He was desperate, clutching at me like I was the last person who could save him. But I couldn't. Whatever had happened to him, I wasn't equipped to deal with it. I kicked out, scrambling to get free, and managed to knock him off balance just enough to shove him away. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, clutching his chest. I ran for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't even lock up. I just got in my car and drove, my hands trembling on the wheel as the gas station faded into the distance behind me. I called the cops from the road, told them about the man, about his condition. I never went back to the station. A week later, I heard on the news that they'd found a body in the woods nearby. A man, beaten and stabbed, left for dead. They said he must have wandered for miles before collapsing at mile marker 17. I never found out if it was him, but I didn't need to. I quit that job the next day. Working the night shift at a convenience store isn't anyone's dream job, but it pays the rent. I was in between gigs, needed something to get by, and a friend hooked me up with this place. Quiet nights, no boss breathing down your neck. It wasn't terrible, but some nights felt longer than others. Those hours between midnight and dawn stretched on forever, especially when all you could hear was the hum of the coolers and the occasional flicker of the neon sign outside. I'd been doing the shift for about 6 months. Nothing crazy ever happened. Drunk customers, college kids coming in for snacks after the bars closed, or truckers grabbing a coffee before hitting the road again. Most nights, it was just me and the clock, counting down until I could finally go home. That night started off like any other. It was just after 2 a.m., and the store was dead quiet. I was in the middle of restocking some chips when the door chime went off. I looked up to see a woman walk in, and right away, something about her set off alarm bells in my head. She looked out of place. Her clothes were all wrong. She was wearing a long skirt and a coat that seemed too heavy for the mild night air. Her hair was wild and tangled, falling across her face. But it wasn't just the clothes. It was the way she moved, stiff and jerky, like she wasn't sure how to walk properly. And then there were her eyes, wide, darting around the store like she was looking for something or someone. I tried to shake off the weird feeling and watched as she made her way down the aisles, not touching anything, not even glancing at the shelves. She headed straight to the back of the store, where the freezers were, and stopped. Just stood there, staring blankly at the glass doors. I walked over to the counter, pretending to straighten things out, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. Something wasn't right. She hadn't looked at me once, hadn't said a word, and the store was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, breaking the silence. My voice came out a little shaky, more nervous than I intended. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the freezer like she was lost in thought or waiting for something to happen. I took a few steps toward her, trying again. "Ma'am, are you looking for something specific?" That's when she turned to me, slowly. Her eyes met mine, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Her face was pale, almost gray under the fluorescent lights, and her lips were cracked, as if she hadn't had a drink in days. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was tight, strained, like it took all her energy just to make the expression. "I'm just waiting," she said in a low voice, barely above a whisper. "Waiting? For what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady, though every instinct was screaming for me to back away. "For him," she replied, her eyes darting to the door, then back to me. Before I could ask who she was talking about, the door chime rang again. I turned, expecting to see someone come in, but the door didn't move. No one entered. I glanced outside and saw nothing but the empty parking lot, the neon sign flickering in the dark. When I turned back, the woman was still standing by the freezers, but her gaze had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring past me, over my shoulder, like someone was standing right behind me. That's when he walked in. A man, mid-40s maybe, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dirty jeans and a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. His hair was slicked back, and there was this cold, blank expression on his face. The second I saw him, my stomach twisted. He had that kind of presence that makes your skin crawl, like he could snap at any moment. He didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge me. His eyes were locked on the woman by the freezer, and then she spoke, so softly I almost missed it. "I told you he'd come," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the man. They knew each other. That much was clear. But the way she looked at him, there was no relief, no warmth, just fear. I felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. The man walked slowly toward her, his footsteps heavy on the linoleum floor. She didn't move, didn't even flinch as he approached. He stopped just inches away from her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with something dark, something dangerous. I knew I should have said something, should have done something, but I was frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I didn't want to be a part of it. Finally, the man broke the silence. "We're leaving." The woman's lips trembled, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, like she knew she didn't have a choice. He grabbed her by the arm, not gently, and started pulling her toward the door. She gave me one last look, and in her eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Desperation, pleading, but she didn't say a word. As they walked out, the door chime rang again, and just like that, they were gone. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick to my stomach. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? A strange woman and a man walked into the store, and now I have a bad feeling. They hadn't done anything, not here anyway. But the look in her eyes stayed with me. I went over to the freezer where she had stood and saw something smeared on the glass. Small, faint, like a fingerprint. A smudge of dirt or blood, I couldn't tell, but it felt like a message, a warning, and I knew that whatever had just happened wasn't over. I never saw them again, but sometimes, when I'm closing up late, I hear the door chime ring, and I half expect to see her walk back in, waiting for him.